James Carter awoke to the comforting scent of freshly brewed coffee drifting from the kitchen. Through the half-open bedroom door, he could hear the gentle sounds of Emily going about her morning routine. She always woke up a half hour earlier to make breakfast, a little act of care he once cherished. But recently, it felt as if an invisible barrier had formed between them, a wall of silence that neither of them knew how to break. Groggily, James climbed out of bed and pulled on his pants and a t-shirt. Their small apartment on the outskirts of Chicago was modestly furnished, but cozy. It was the home they'd envisioned when they first married 5 years ago, just after Emily turned 27 and he hit 30. Back then, they had dreams of saving enough to buy a house of their own. But now, that dream felt further out of reach with each passing day. "Good morning," James said, stepping into the kitchen. Emily turned to smile at him, a soft curve of her lips. Her dark hair was pulled back into a casual bun, and she wore no makeup. Even in her house robe, she still looked attractive. "Coffee's ready. Scrambled eggs in a minute," she replied, returning to the stove. James sat down at the table, stretching out the newspaper. He glanced at the job listings, an automatic reflex, but he knew it was pointless. Since Jackson and Sons had shut down after he worked there for 8 years, finding a decent-paying job had been a challenge. The bigger companies required diplomas, which he didn't have, and the small shops offered wages too low to live on. "Are you going to be late for work today?" James asked, as Emily set a plate of eggs in front of him. "Yes," she sighed. "Mr. Bennett wants us to review all the policies from the last quarter. Don't expect me home before 9. James nodded. These conversations had become routine. Emily was staying late more and more often at the insurance company, always explaining that her workload had increased. "I went over the invoices yesterday," he said, lifting his eyes from the paper. "We're short on rent again this month." Emily froze, the brush she was holding stilling in her hand. "Should we borrow money from my mom?" she asked quietly. "No," James replied quickly. "We already borrowed from her 3 months ago. I'll figure something out." Breakfast passed in awkward silence. James watched Emily finish getting ready for work, applying light makeup, picking out earrings, and brushing her hair. He used to enjoy watching her prepare to go out, but now it just irritated him. He thought she was focusing too much on her appearance for what was just another day at the office. "I'm off," Emily said, kissing him on the cheek. "Don't forget to call about the job opening at Midtown Motors. You said they were looking for a mechanic." "I already did," James mumbled, not looking up. "They need a certified technician." When the door clicked shut behind Emily, James remained seated, staring at the cold coffee in his cup. His phone buzzed with a message from Tony, an old high school friend who still lived nearby. Tony had always been on the edge of the law, but James knew him as a guy who could sometimes offer a quick fix for financial problems. "Got a job for one night. Quick money. $1,000 in a couple hours. Give me a call if you're interested." James paused, considering the offer. Tony's ventures had always been shady, and after high school, they'd drifted apart because of Tony's increasingly questionable choices. But $1,000 could solve a lot of problems: rent, the overdue car loan, the electric bill. Everything had piled up over the last few months. He set the phone aside, unwilling to answer just yet. He needed to exhaust all other options first. By noon, James had called 5 more auto repair shops. The answers were all the same: "Sorry, no vacancies, or try calling back in a month." The last place offered him a minimum wage job with no health insurance and a 3-month probationary period. He glanced back at Tony's message. $1,000 in a couple hours. He could pay off the debts and maybe even save a little. "Where should we meet?" He typed, his mouth dry. Tony's reply came back almost instantly. "Joe's Bar, 8 o'clock tonight. The password is Red Cadillac." James grinned. Tony always had a flair for the dramatic, as if everything had to be cloaked in mystery. The bar was loud and smoky, the air thick with chatter and the clinking of glasses. Tony sat in a far corner, sipping his beer, looking unchanged since James had last seen him. His eyes still had that sly glint, and the gold chains around his neck gleamed under the dim light. His frame had filled out a little, but otherwise, he was the same old Tony. "Jimmy," Tony grinned as James approached the table. "It's been a long time." Hello, Tony, James replied coolly. What's the job? Tony leaned forward, lowering his voice. It's simple. I need a car moved from point A to point B. No questions asked, no unnecessary chatter. Money's on the spot when you deliver. James raised an eyebrow. Is the car stolen? Tony feigned offense. What do you take me for? Of course not. It's just that, let's say the owner wants it moved quietly. The paperwork's in order, the car is clean. James didn't believe a word of it, but his desperation drowned out reason. $1,000, you say? Cash right after delivery. Tony nodded. Pick up the car at midnight tonight. Deliver it by morning. Clean and simple. What if there's a problem? James asked. Tony smiled with a certain coldness. There won't be a problem. I told you, the paperwork's in order. James took the sheet of addresses and the car keys. Don't let me down, Tony. When had I ever let you down? Tony replied with a smile, but his eyes remained steely. At midnight, James stood in a deserted parking lot near an abandoned warehouse. A brand-new silver Audi sat there, looking strangely out of place in the rundown neighborhood. James inspected the car. It had no scratches, the interior looked pristine, and a full set of papers sat in the glove compartment. Maybe Tony was telling the truth, James thought, starting the engine. He drove out onto the highway, heading toward the outskirts of Milwaukee where he was supposed to drop the car off. The road was empty, and for a moment, James allowed himself to relax, the soft music playing and the rain splashing against the windshield. For a brief moment, it felt like things were getting better. That illusion was shattered when red and blue lights suddenly flashed in the rearview mirror. His heart sank. He pulled over to the curb, panicked, unsure what to do. The officer, a short man with a bushy mustache, approached the car at a leisurely pace. Good evening, sir. Car papers, please. James handed over the papers, trying to steady his trembling hands. Is something wrong, officer? James asked. Routine inspection, the officer replied, examining the papers. Do you mind if I check the VIN number? Of course not. The officer walked back to his car, and James felt a cold sweat running down his back. A few minutes later, the officer returned. His expression changed. Sir, step out of the car, please. This Audi has been reported stolen since yesterday. There must be some misunderstanding, James began, but stopped when he saw the officer's hand move toward his holster. Step out of the car and keep your hands where I can see them. At the police station, James sat in the interview room, staring at the peeling paint on the walls. He tried calling Tony, but there was no answer. No response on his cell phone. No known address for him. Tony had vanished. Mr. Carter, Detective Harris said tiredly, rubbing his eyes. Your story doesn't add up. You claim you didn't know the car was stolen, yet you met with Tony at midnight in an abandoned parking lot. Not exactly the most common place for a legitimate transaction, is it? James didn't say anything. The detective was right. It looked exactly like he'd agreed to move a stolen car for money. I'll call my wife, James finally said, his voice heavy. She'll get a lawyer. 2 hours later, Emily arrived. She looked pale and confused, her usually neat hair falling messily over her shoulders. She was in her house clothes, clearly having rushed out as soon as she got the call. James, what's going on? She asked, her voice tight as she looked through the bars of the temporary cell. I screwed up, James said, his voice low. I agreed to do business with Tony. Move the car for $1,000, and it turns out it was stolen. Tony? The Tony from high school? Emily's eyes widened in horror. You knew what he was like, James muttered, looking down. I did, but we needed money, rent a loan. Emily put a hand to her mouth as if to hold back a scream. Jesus, James. The weight of his decisions crashed down on him. He had made a choice that had led them here, a choice that threatened to unravel everything. What were you thinking? Do you realize you could go to jail? Emily's voice trembled with fear and frustration. I do, James answered quietly. I need a lawyer. The following days passed in a blur. James's public defender, Mr. Johnson, was young and inexperienced. He explained James's situation with brutal honesty. You have no prior convictions, which is a plus. But the problem is you were caught driving a stolen car. It's nearly impossible to prove you didn't know about it. At best, you're looking at probation, but at worst, you could face up to 5 years in prison. The first hearing took place a week later. Emily sat in the front row, pale and gaunt, having taken time off work to attend. The prosecutor was relentless. The defendant was caught red-handed transporting a stolen vehicle worth over $70,000, he said, his voice firm. Although he has no criminal record, this is a felony, and such a serious offense demands appropriate punishment. Mr. Johnson tried to offer some relief, highlighting James's impeccable record, his stable work history before the auto shop closed, his cooperation with the investigation, and his otherwise clean background. The judge, an older woman with a stern gaze, listened to both sides and then announced her decision. The court takes into account the defendant's lack of a criminal record and his cooperation. However, the gravity of the offense does not allow for a suspended sentence. She paused and then delivered the verdict. James Carter is sentenced to 5 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 3. James's heart sank as the words echoed in his mind. 5 years, 1,825 days away from Emily, from home, from everything he knew, all because of one impulsive, desperate decision. He felt the weight of it pressing down on him. As he was led out of the courtroom, Emily's tears streamed down her face. "I'll be waiting," she whispered through her sobs. "We'll get through this, James. It's not over." "I'm sorry," he said softly, barely able to speak the words. Riverdale Correctional Facility was about a 2-hour drive from Chicago. By the standards of the prison system, it was considered a relatively good place. Medium security, no particularly dangerous inmates. James arrived there on a cold October afternoon, carrying only a small bag of personal belongings. The admission process was degrading. Inspection, disinfection, and the issuing of prison uniforms. But the worst part was losing his identity. He was no longer James Carter, an auto mechanic from Chicago. He was now just inmate number RL 8847-305-2055. He met Victor, his new cellmate, a man in his mid-30s, already serving his second sentence, 7 years for drug distribution. Victor appraised him with a sharp glance. "First time?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "Yeah," James replied, trying to mask the uncertainty in his voice. "How long?" Victor asked. 5 years, James answered quietly. Victor whistled low in surprise. "For moving a stolen car? That's tough." He paused, then added, "You got caught behind the wheel, huh?" James nodded, arranging his few belongings on the narrow bunk. "Yeah. You got a wife?" Victor asked, a glint of curiosity in his eyes. "She'll wait," James replied, his voice firm. Victor grinned, but didn't comment further. That first night in prison, James lay awake, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of his new life. The distant murmur of conversations, the footsteps of guards, the clanking of metal doors. He thought about Emily, how she was coping alone. They had never been apart for more than a few days before. Now, they faced years of separation. In the morning, his new life would begin. The life of a prisoner, counting down the days to freedom. 5 years seemed like an eternity, but James held on to the hope that Emily would wait for him. She promised, and he clung to that promise like the last lifeline in a sea of despair. The first month at Riverdale dragged on endlessly. Every day began the same way. The shrill sound of the siren at 6 a.m., roll call, breakfast in the noisy dining hall, and then work. Since James had experience as a mechanic, he was assigned to the prison auto shop, fixing company cars, and sometimes the guards' personal vehicles. It helped pass the time and gave him something to focus on, other than the life that seemed so far away outside the prison walls. Victor Rodriguez, his cellmate, had been in and out of prison for years. He had learned the unwritten rules of prison life and took James under his wing. Never get involved in other people's disputes, he warned James. Don't borrow money, and don't trust anyone who promises you easy money. Just keep your head down. James absorbed these lessons in silence, trying to adjust to the harsh realities of his new life. It was hard to believe how quickly everything had changed. One moment, he had been living a normal life with Emily, and now he was here a prisoner, surrounded by strangers. But as the days turned into weeks, and then into months, James focused on one thing: getting out. He had to believe that one day he would return to Emily and rebuild the life they once dreamed of. Don't play cards for money, and most importantly, stay away from gangs. They love to recruit new recruits, Victor advised James, his voice low and serious. James had learned quickly that survival in prison wasn't about strength. It was about keeping your head down and avoiding trouble. The smartest survive here, not the strongest. James followed Victor's advice, trying to stay under the radar. He wasn't a weakling, but he knew that prison life had its own set of rules. The first few months were an adjustment, but as time went on, he began to settle into the routine. Every Saturday, Emily came to visit. The 2-hour drive each way seemed exhausting, but she never complained. James could feel the weight of her presence in the room, the warmth of her smile cutting through the darkness of his incarceration. Her visits were the highlight of his week. "I talked to Mr. Johnson," she reported on her third visit. "He thinks there's a good chance for parole in 3 years if you maintain good behavior." James nodded quietly, focusing on her hands. The wedding ring she wore was still in place, just as it always had been. "How are you doing? Is everything okay with the money?" Emily squeezed his hand reassuringly. "I got a promotion at the office. I'm an assistant account manager now, so the pay is higher, but there's more work." A shadow crossed her face, but she quickly masked it with a smile. "But don't worry, we're managing." James didn't press her, though he noticed the small flicker of worry in her eyes. He didn't want to burden her further. "That's great news," he said with a smile. "I'm so proud of you." Emily wrote to him regularly, 2 or 3 times a week. Her letters were filled with details of her life, work, the weather, movies she had seen, and small stories about everyday life. These little snippets of normalcy connected him to the world beyond the prison walls. "Went to the movies with Carol and Jan today," Emily wrote in one letter. "So, a new romantic comedy with Ryan Gosling. You wouldn't have liked it, too many sentimental scenes. But we had a lot of fun. Afterward, we went to that Italian restaurant where we celebrated your 30th birthday. I miss our dinners together." Each letter was a lifeline. James read every one multiple times, savoring the scent of her perfume on the paper, the feeling that Emily was still a part of his world. By the 3rd month of his incarceration, James had settled into the rhythm of prison life. He had made some friends, particularly in the machine shop. He had started earning the respect of the other inmates, even being trusted with more complex repairs. One evening, as James and Victor played a game of chess in their cell, Victor broke the silence. "Does your wife still come every week?" "Yes," James replied, moving his queen across the board. "Why?" Victor shrugged. "Impressive. Usually by the 3rd month, the enthusiasm dies down, especially with a young and beautiful wife." James frowned, his gaze hardening. "What do you mean?" Victor made a move, then leaned back in his chair. "Nothing in particular, just an observation. I've seen it too many times. Hot wives like that rarely stay faithful when their husbands are behind bars for 5 years. James's anger flared. "Emily is not like that." Victor raised his hands in mock surrender. "Sorry if I offended you. I've just seen too many stories like that. I'm glad it's different for you." "Checkmate," Victor said, grinning as he won the game. But the victory was hollow to James. Doubt had been planted in his mind. The next week, Emily didn't show up. She called to apologize, explaining that an urgent project at work had kept her away. James understood, but couldn't shake the disappointment. It was the first time in almost 4 months that she had missed a visit. 2 weeks later, she arrived, looking tired but happy. She was wearing a new dress, simple but clearly expensive. "That's a beautiful dress," James remarked. "Thanks," Emily smiled. "I thought I'd treat myself after the promotion. I can afford to do a little shopping now." James nodded. "You deserve it." Their conversation seemed to follow the usual routine. She talked about work, her new boss, and how demanding the job had become. "I've been staying late a lot," she explained. "Sometimes I even take work home with me." "You shouldn't exhaust yourself," James said softly. "Take care of yourself." "I'm fine," Emily responded, though there was a subtle change in her tone. "It's just easier to stay busy. Easier not to think about everything." James's heart sank as he realized what she meant. She didn't want to think about him, about being in prison, about what they had lost. By the 6th month, Emily's visits had become less frequent. Now she only came twice a month, and her letters had dwindled too. What used to be detailed updates about her life were now short, almost impersonal notes written in a telegraphic style. At the prison, Victor Rodriguez had noticed the change too. "Your wife's a little slow on the uptake," he remarked one day, referring to James's letters. James didn't respond. He simply focused on the work, trying to avoid the gnawing feeling in his gut that told him Emily was slipping further away. James interrupted with a sharp response. "Yeah, work." Riggs, an older inmate with a rough sense of humor, made a lewd gesture. "Is that what they're calling it now?" he quipped, dodging the wrench James threw at him. Riggs laughed. "Easy, Carter. Can't you take a joke?" The jokes were becoming more frequent. The older inmates loved to tell stories about their wives. Stories of betrayal, of wives who'd promised to wait, only to fall for someone else. "My Lorraine swore she'd wait," Big Al had said over lunch. "When I got out, I found out she was having her second kid with my old partner. She said, 'I'm sorry, Al, but 6 years is too long.'" James tried his best not to listen to these stories, but they crept into his mind, poisoning his thoughts. One cold January day, well after Christmas, the Christmas Emily had spent with her parents in Detroit, James received an anonymous letter. There was no return address, no signature. Inside, he found a photograph of Emily, sitting in a restaurant with a strange man. They were laughing, their hands casually touching on the table. There was nothing particularly compromising in the photo, but the look on her face, that pure joy, made James's stomach churn. He hadn't seen her look that happy in months, not since he'd been in prison. Without thinking, James ripped the photo to shreds and tossed it aside. Victor, his cellmate, noticed his unease when James returned to their cell. "Who's the letter from?" he asked, watching James with an unreadable expression. "I don't know," James muttered. "Some idiot trying to get inside my head with a stupid joke." Victor looked at him carefully. "A picture of your wife with another man? That's a classic," he shrugged. "Don't pay attention to it. Half of those photos are fake, photoshopped. You've got nothing to worry about." But the doubt had already taken root deep inside James. He couldn't shake the image of Emily's radiant smile in the photograph. He began to remember things. Small details. Emily's new perfume, the expensive hair clip she'd never worn before, a passing comment about a new restaurant that served truffle risotto. They couldn't afford that kind of restaurant before. Then, in February, Emily came to visit just once. She looked beautiful, a fresh haircut, a light tan. James noticed the difference. "Have you been to the tanning salon?" he asked. "Oh, no," she faltered. "Just got a good night's sleep." James nodded, but his mind was already racing. He noticed the delicate silver bracelet on her wrist. "It's a beautiful bracelet," he commented. "Thanks," Emily replied, absent-mindedly touching the bracelet. "It's a birthday gift from a coworker." James frowned slightly. Her birthday had been 2 weeks ago, and he had sent her a simple hand-drawn card. There was nothing else he could afford to give her. The homemade card now felt insignificant compared to the expensive bracelet she wore. "How's work?" James asked, trying to shift the conversation. "It's good," she smiled, though there was a tinge of something he couldn't quite place in her eyes. "We merged with the legal department. Lots of new faces, interesting projects. I'm happy for you," James said sincerely, though a strange unease had begun to settle in his chest. "And you?" she asked, her smile still in place, but her gaze flickering away. "Still working in the workshop?" James nodded, his mind still lingering on the growing tension between them. They continued talking about mundane things for the rest of the visit, as if nothing had changed, but James felt the walls between them growing taller. Emily glanced at her watch more often than usual, and when she kissed him goodbye, James caught a whiff of a new perfume, one he didn't recognize. It was sophisticated, expensive. "Is that new?" he asked, trying to mask his growing concern. "Yes," she blushed slightly. "Do you like it?" James lied. "It's nice." But in truth, the scent felt like another invisible wall between them. Emily was slipping away from him, becoming a stranger. The unease settled deeper inside him, and he knew something was wrong. The next few weeks passed in a blur. There were no letters for 3 weeks. Then came a short note from Emily. Sorry I haven't written. Work got in the way. I won't be able to come this weekend. Kiss Izzy. James reread the note several times, feeling an ache deep in his chest. No love, just kisses. Like an old friend, not his wife. Victor, noticing James's state, asked, "Trouble with the wife?" James silently handed him the note. Victor read it and shook his head. "Not good," he said. "Maybe she really has a lot of work to do. Maybe she doesn't." "What do you mean?" James asked, his voice tight. Victor sat down opposite him, his tone serious. "Look, Jimmy, I don't want to pry into your personal life, but this is my second time behind bars, and I've seen a lot of stories like this. At first, they come every week, then once a month. Then the letters get shorter, and then—" Victor snapped his fingers. "A letter comes where she lets you go free and wishes you to find your happiness." James gritted his teeth. "Emily isn't like that." Victor's eyes softened. "No one thinks their wife will cheat, Jimmy, but life goes on. Jimmy, she's young, beautiful, got a promotion, new people, new environment. And here you are behind bars for 5 years." Victor's words hung in the air, sharp and pointed, but James held his ground. "I trust her," James replied stubbornly. Victor, standing across the room, shook his head. "But if you want to be sure, I've got friends on the outside. They can keep an eye on her for you." James wanted to lash out, to tell Victor to take his friends and go to hell, but something inside him snapped. Maybe it was the anonymous photo, the new perfume, the silver bracelet. Maybe it was the stories of the other prisoners, their tales of wives who started off as loving and loyal, but slowly drifted away. The seed of doubt had taken root, and now it needed feeding. "Just make sure she's all right," James said, his voice quieter, his resistance breaking down. Victor nodded. "Sure, I'll talk to the right people." Emily didn't show up for the next visit. She didn't call. She didn't write. James tried to bury himself and work at the prison auto shop, but it wasn't working. He was making mistakes, snapping at comments, nearly fighting with Riggs over a dumb joke. "Well, Carter," the wife busy with work again. Riggs smirked, making an obscene gesture. James lunged at him, but the other inmates separated them. The workshop manager warned James he'd be transferred to general labor if this kept up. The tension was building, but James couldn't stop it. His mind was consumed with worry about Emily, with doubts he couldn't shake. 10 days later, Victor returned with news. "My friend Eddie's been keeping an eye on your Emily for a while," Victor said, his voice low as they were alone in the cell. It wasn't anything serious, just watching from a distance. James felt his mouth dry up, and he couldn't speak, waiting for the rest. Victor pulled out some photos from the book he had been reading. "Eddie says she's been hanging around with some lawyer. John Miller, or something." James's hands trembled as he took the pictures from Victor. The first one showed Emily leaving an office building with a tall man in an expensive suit. The second showed them getting into a fancy car, definitely not James's or Emily's. The third was of them sitting in a restaurant, clinking glasses. The fourth, taken outside an apartment building, showed Emily laughing at something, standing next to the same man, who was holding the door open for her. "This isn't my apartment," James said quietly, the words tasting bitter. Victor nodded. "It's Miller's place. Eddie checked it out. And your wife," he hesitated, "spent the night there." James's mind was reeling. "When was that?" 3 days ago, Victor replied. "Friday." James's face twisted into a bitter grin. "The same day she was supposed to come see me?" Victor nodded silently, and James folded the photos neatly, handing them back to Victor. "Thanks for the truth," James muttered, his voice hollow. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know," James admitted honestly. "I guess I'll wait for her to tell me." But Emily didn't tell him anything when she came back a week later. She acted as if nothing had happened. She talked about her work, a new movie she'd seen, how she'd started going to the gym. James sat there, nodding, but he didn't hear a word she said. There were the pictures of her with John Miller in his mind, glasses of wine, her laughter, his apartment door. "You're a little quiet tonight," Emily remarked. "Is something wrong?" "No," James replied, his voice tight. "I'm just tired." As she left, he didn't kiss her goodbye. He just nodded. "See you later." He watched her walk across the visitation room, slim and beautiful, in a new dress and a new haircut. She looked so different, Not at all like the Emily he knew. She was alien him now. Back in his cell, James sat on the bunk, covering his face with his hands. He didn't cry. He just sat there motionless, hour after hour. That evening, Victor called out to him. "How are you?" "I don't know," James answered, his voice strained. "I just don't know." "Did she say anything?" "No," James replied. "She just acted like everything was fine, like nothing was happening." Victor sat down next to him. "News like this doesn't come easily. Maybe she's waiting for the right moment. Or maybe she's just not going to say anything." James grinned bitterly. "Why? I'm here. He's there. She can have it all." Victor didn't argue. "You'll figure it out, Jimmy. Just don't ignore the signs." James sat in silence, a mix of confusion and betrayal swirling in his mind. He wanted to believe in Emily, but the weight of the truth was too much to bear. The trust, the love they'd built together, was it all just a lie? James raised his head after a long pause, his thoughts clouded with uncertainty. "What can I do? 3 years until possible parole. By then, they'll probably be married." Victor remained silent, staring at the ground. After a moment, he spoke, his voice almost a whisper. "There's another option." James looked at him indifferently. "What's the option?" "Escape." James stared at his cellmate, trying to understand if Victor was serious. "Are you kidding?" Victor nodded firmly. "No, I'm not. Riverdale isn't Alcatraz. There are security gaps here. I've studied them during my first term, but there was never any reason to run before." He paused, looking at James, as if weighing his next words. "But now, I'm looking at 3 more years, and I'm not sure I'll make it to the end." "What are you talking about?" James asked, his voice flat. Victor sighed, his expression somber. "I have a heart problem. The doctor says I need surgery, but they won't do it here. It's too expensive for a prisoner. So, I have nothing to lose." James shook his head, disbelief clear in his voice. "This is crazy. If they catch me, they'll double my sentence." Victor shrugged nonchalantly. "If they catch us, sure. But I know people who can help you on the outside. New papers, money. We get to Mexico. From there, the possibilities are endless." James cut him off. "It's too much. Think about it." Victor stood up, stepping toward James with determination in his eyes. "What's keeping you here, Jimmy? A wife who's sleeping with another man? A job in a prison workshop for pennies? 3 years before parole, and who knows if you'll even get it?" James didn't answer. Victor's words were sharp and true, hitting him in places he didn't want to acknowledge. That night, James lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Images of Emily with John, their laughter, their glasses of wine, and the door to his apartment closing behind them filled his mind. The more he thought about it, the more the pain grew, cutting deeper and deeper. The next morning, he spoke quietly to Victor. "I'll think about your proposal." Victor nodded. "Take your time. These decisions aren't made overnight." But James had already made up his mind. He would wait for Emily's next visit. If she told him the truth, admitted to cheating, he would serve his time. If she continued to lie, he would escape. Emily didn't come for the next visit, or the one after that. A short letter arrived 2 weeks later. "Sorry, a lot of work. I'll try to come back next month." James crumpled the letter in his hand. That evening, Victor asked, "What's your answer?" James looked Victor straight in the eye. "I agree. Tell me your plan." Victor's escape plan was simple, yet audacious. Riverdale Correctional Facility, despite its reputation for being secure, had its weaknesses. The biggest one was the warehouse adjacent to the east wall, where food and supplies were delivered once a month. During unloading, the guards got careless. The entrance gate is open, and everyone's busy hauling boxes, Victor explained, drawing a diagram on a scrap of paper. "That's when we slip into the back of the truck and hide among the empty pallets." James frowned, his voice laced with doubt. "And if they find us?" Victor shrugged. "There's always a risk, but we'll pick the right moment." Victor had contacts on the outside who helped them prepare. 2 weeks passed, and Victor, through his connections, had figured out the delivery schedule, the truck route, and the guard shifts. James took care of the smaller details, getting food from the mess hall, begging other prisoners for warm clothes to wear, as if working in the cold section of the workshop. "You'll need documents and money," Victor told him one evening. I've arranged for someone in Chicago to make a new driver's license and social security card. It'll cost $2,000. James shook his head. I don't have that kind of money. I've got $900 saved up. Emily doesn't know about it. That's a good start, Victor replied. My guy can wait for the rest. You're a mechanic. You'll get a job and pay it off. The day of the escape arrived. It was a chilly Wednesday in mid-March when Victor received the signal from his contact. The truck would be parked for at least an hour, and security would be minimal. You ready? Victor asked as they walked across the yard to the workshop. James nodded, his stomach a mass of nerves and excitement. His decision had been made. There was no turning back now. During the lunch break, they subtly separated from the main group of prisoners. As planned, they sneaked toward the back of the yard. The time was right. As the guards were distracted by a fight in the mess hall, James and Victor slipped toward the warehouse. A large truck was already parked there, and workers were unloading crates. They hid behind a stack of empty pallets, waiting for the right moment. 20 minutes passed in agonizing silence. Finally, the unloading finished, and the truck driver went to sign the documents. One of the guards wandered off to the bathroom, leaving the area unguarded. Now, Victor whispered. The two men quickly darted into the back of the truck, hiding among the empty crates in the far corner. James's heart was pounding in his chest, and he was sure the sound would give them away. Footsteps echoed in the distance. The truck's cab door slammed shut, and the engine roared to life. Lie still, Victor muttered. Now, there'll be a checkpoint. Then freedom. At the checkpoint, the truck came to a stop. James heard the guard talking to the driver. Then footsteps as someone walked around the truck. The back door creaked open. Is it empty? A voice asked. Clear, another answered. Just empty containers. The door slammed shut, and the truck started moving again. James's nerves were on edge, but after a few minutes, he felt the truck picking up speed. We've done it, Victor exhaled. Now we wait for the turn at the 80th kilometer. Eddie should pick us up there. Half an hour later, the truck slowed as it neared a sharp curve. Victor cautiously opened the back door and peeked out. I see Eddie, he said. Gray Ford on the right. Get ready to jump when the car slows. James's heart was in his throat as the truck began to slow. At the sharp turn, Victor swung the door open and shouted, Come on. They jumped onto the curb, rolling across the ditch and rushing toward Eddie's car. The engine was already running, and Eddie, a burly man with tattoos on his neck, opened the back door. Hurry up, boys, he said. Get in and get down. The car sped away before they could even shut the door. Clean job. Eddie grinned, glancing in the rearview mirror. No one even noticed. James leaned back in his seat, trying to catch his breath. He was free. The unknown future stretched ahead of him. But there was one thing he knew for sure. He needed to get to Chicago. He needed to see Emily, to confront her betrayal with his own eyes. Where to now? He asked, as the euphoria of escape began to wear off. To a friend of mine in Joliet, Eddie replied. You'll stay there for a couple of days, change your appearance, get your papers. Then you'll scatter. The farther away from each other, the safer. James nodded, his eyes fixed on the fields rushing by outside. Freedom tasted of adrenaline and fear. In Joliet, they arrived at an unremarkable house on the outskirts of town. It was owned by a gruff man named Ray, who led them to the basement. The room had 2 narrow beds, a refrigerator stocked with food, and a tiny bathroom. Toilets are over there, Ray mumbled. Wipe your feet. No going upstairs. No leaving the house. Your IDs will be here in 2 days. James slept for nearly 24 hours, feeling relatively safe for the first time in a long while. When he woke up, Victor handed him the morning paper. On the front page, there was a picture of them, under the headline, Daring Escape from Riverdale. They're looking for us now, Victor said. We'll need to change our appearance. With Ray's help, James and Victor transformed beyond recognition. James shaved the beard he'd grown in prison, dyed his hair darker, and began wearing thin-rimmed glasses. Victor, on the other hand, shaved his beard and dyed his hair a light blonde. On the 3rd day, Ray brought their new papers, driver's licenses, social security cards, even credit cards with a small balance. You're Daniel Foster now, Ray said, handing James his new identity. Born in Ohio, Worked as an auto mechanic in Toledo. Memorized these details. They might ask. James looked at the new ID. The man in the photo resembled him, but seemed subtly different. A more confident look, a different haircut. What now? James asked. Now, our paths diverge, Victor replied. I'm going to Texas, then Mexico. You, Chicago. James's voice was firm. I'm going to Chicago. Victor hesitated. It's risky. They might recognize you there. James didn't flinch. I need to finish something. Victor nodded. Then let's get you ready. Time's running out. Victor studied James carefully. Is this about your wife? He asked, his voice flat. Forget it, my friend. She's made her own choices. James didn't answer right away. Deep down, he knew what he wanted. He wanted to see Emily, talk to her, maybe even confront her. Revenge? He wasn't sure. But one thing was certain. He had to go to Chicago. They parted ways at the bus station in Joliet. Victor caught a bus to St. Louis, while James bought a ticket for Chicago. Be careful, Victor warned, and don't do anything stupid. James nodded. But in his heart, he knew the reason he was going to Chicago was precisely to do something stupid. It was the biggest mistake he'd ever make, but he couldn't stop himself. Chicago greeted him with drizzle and gray skies. James stepped off the bus, pulling his cap low over his eyes. The city felt both familiar and foreign. It was as if he'd returned after a long absence, only to find the streets had subtly shifted and the buildings seemed to have changed. He rented a cheap motel room on the outskirts, paying cash for a week in advance. The elderly Vietnamese man who ran the motel didn't even glance at James's ID. He just took the money. On his first day in the city, James didn't dare go near the apartment he and Emily had shared. Instead, he bought a prepaid phone from a nearby store and called the number where his stash had been kept. Auto Pawn Shop Express. How can I help you? A familiar voice answered. Hi, Lou. This is Daniel, James said, hesitating. I'm a friend of Jimmy Carter. He asked me to pick something up from the safe deposit box. There was a pause. Carter is kind of unavailable right now, Lou said cautiously. I know, James replied. He asked me to help his wife financially. There's a stash in safety deposit box 123. The code is his mother's birthday. Lou hesitated. I heard about the Riverdale escape. I don't want any trouble. It's all clear, James assured him. I'm just doing what Jimmy asked me to do. Lou sighed. Okay, come back tomorrow morning. But no tricks. I keep a shotgun under the counter. The next day, James picked up his $900 from Lou. The man examined him closely but didn't seem to recognize him, especially with the new look. Now that he had his money and papers, the only thing left was finding Emily. He started at their old apartment. He arrived in the afternoon and took a position in a cafe across the street, where he could clearly see the entrance to the building. 2 hours passed before he saw her. Emily stepped out of the entryway, but she wasn't alone. A tall man in an expensive suit stood beside her, the same John Miller from the photographs. James's heart clenched in his chest. Seeing the pictures was one thing, but seeing his wife walking with another man, laughing, clinging to him, was a different kind of betrayal. They got into a black Lexus and drove off. James followed them in a cab, keeping his distance. The Lexus brought the couple to an apartment building in an upscale part of Chicago. It wasn't the same building where he and Emily used to live. The security guard at the entrance nodded respectfully to John, who walked inside with Emily, holding hands. They moved together as naturally as if they'd done it hundreds of times before. James watched them for hours, parked on the street across from the building. He waited until he found the right window. On the 5th floor, the light was on, and he could see the silhouettes of Emily and John moving about in the apartment. For 3 days, James followed them, studying their routine. Emily and John left for work in the morning, returned in the evening. Sometimes they ate dinner at home, sometimes at restaurants. They looked like a normal, happy couple. It was as if James never existed. On the 4th day, the guard, now used to the strange man sitting on the bench across the street, approached James. Is everything all right, sir? The guard asked. James gave a sheepish smile. Yes, of course. I'm waiting for a girl. First date. A little nervous. The guard smiled knowingly. She lives in this building? Yes, apartment 512, James said. The guard's expression changed. Mr. Miller lives there with his fiancée. The word fiancé hit James like a blow. Emily had been his wife, but now she was another man's fiancée. James's stomach churned as the reality of the situation set in. He had come to Chicago to find answers, but what he discovered left him feeling more lost than ever. James had barely looked at the number on his phone before he muttered to himself, "Must have the wrong number." He said it quickly, trying to mask the nervousness rising in his chest. The guard, though, raised an eyebrow, looking at him suspiciously for a moment. He had to leave before things got more complicated, trying to avoid drawing any unnecessary attention. On Friday evening, James made his way back to the apartment building, knowing that John and Emily often stayed in on Fridays. He positioned himself in a small public garden across from their windows, preparing himself for a long, painful wait. At 8 p.m., the soft glow of lights illuminated the apartment. James watched as John set the table, lighting candles and opening a bottle of wine. Emily emerged from another room, her figure draped in a beautiful black dress James had never seen before. They sat together at the table, occasionally reaching across the surface to touch each other. Every touch, every smile, every casual gesture felt like a stab to James's heart. His fists clenched at his sides, his nails digging into his palms. Every moment of intimacy between them felt like a cruel reminder of what he had lost. After dinner, they moved to the couch, glasses of wine in hand. John turned on some music, and the two of them danced slowly, their bodies pressed closely together. Then came the kiss, long, passionate, and filled with an intimacy James couldn't bear. John's hands slid down Emily's back, undoing the zipper of her dress. It slid to the floor, leaving Emily exposed before him. James turned away, shaking his head, his mind spinning with a mixture of rage and pain. He couldn't hold himself together any longer. All the control he had managed to maintain over the past few days shattered like glass. His vision blurred, red spots dancing before his eyes. The night felt endless. James didn't remember waiting until morning, nor the hours he spent shivering on the bench, cold and consumed by anger. But when he saw John leave the apartment in the morning, getting into his car, James's heart sank. He waited until the Lexus disappeared around the corner before he knew it was time to act. With his eyes still filled with anger, James walked toward the apartment. He knew the guard would be on his rounds, leaving his post empty for a few minutes. Seizing the opportunity, he slipped inside, making his way to the 5th floor. He stood before the door of apartment 512 and rang the bell. Moments later, Emily opened the door, her face turning pale when she saw him standing there. "James?" she whispered, shock and disbelief evident in her voice. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice steady, though his insides churned with emotion. Emily hesitated, glancing over her shoulder before stepping back to allow him inside. The apartment was everything their old home had never been: spacious, modern, and luxurious. Expensive furniture, beautiful paintings, and a panoramic view of the city. It was nothing like the humble apartment they had shared. "I heard about the escape," Emily said as they walked into the living room. "But I didn't think." "Why are you here, James?" "They're looking for you." "I wanted to see you," James said simply, his voice low. "To find out the truth." "The truth?" Emily's eyes darkened. "What truth?" "About you and John." "About your relationship," he replied, his voice cold. Emily swallowed, nervously, trying to avoid his gaze. "I was going to tell you. I just didn't know how. I didn't want to hurt you." James's eyes narrowed. "When did it start?" "Right after you were arrested," Emily whispered. She looked up, her eyes filled with a mix of sadness and regret. "I waited for you. I did. For the first few months, I came every week. You remember? But then I met John." James felt a knot tighten in his chest. "You decided not to wait." Emily's eyes filled with tears. "No, James. It wasn't like that. I didn't want to replace you. But I was so lonely." James shook his head. 5 years is a long time, Emily. You decided you couldn't wait anymore." "I didn't decide," she argued softly. "I fell in love with someone else. It just happened. And the promises we made—" James's voice trembled. "I'll wait for you. We'll get through this. Remember those words?" "I believed them back then," she said, her voice shaky. But life goes on, James. I couldn't just wait forever. What about me? James asked, his voice thick with frustration. What do you think I did? Do you think it was easy for me in there, knowing you were alone? Emily raised her hands in a protective gesture, her eyes brimming with tears. I understand that you're upset, but please don't be angry with me. Upset? James almost screamed, his voice raw with pain. I've lost everything, Emily. My job, my freedom, my home. The only thing I had left was you. Your loyalty. Your love. I'm sorry, James, she said quietly, but I can't go back in time. John and I are engaged. The wedding is in June. Her words hit James like a hammer to the chest. The reality of it shattered him. You're my wife, he whispered, grabbing her by the shoulders. You're mine. Let me go. Emily screamed, trying to break free. You're hurting me. James didn't seem to hear her, the rage and pain blinding him. He could no longer control his emotions. James sat on the couch, staring at Emily. The room, once a place of comfort and memories, now felt like a prison, as cold as the steel bars he'd left behind. You slept with him, he hissed, his voice filled with venom, while I was rotting in jail. You laughed with him, drank wine with him, and wrote me those stupid notes about how much work you had to do. Emily struggled in his grip, her fear turning into desperation. I'll scream, she threatened, her voice trembling. James's eyes narrowed. Who's going to hear you? He spat. John has gone to work, and the neighbors aren't home. A flicker of real fear crossed her face. What are you going to do? James didn't have an answer. He had come to Chicago fueled by anger and jealousy, but now, standing face to face with Emily, he realized he didn't know what he was supposed to do. He hadn't thought this far ahead. James, please, she pleaded, her voice shaking. Go away. John will be back soon. He forgot his papers. I'm not going anywhere, he said stubbornly, stepping closer to her. Not until we figure this out. Suddenly, Emily broke free from his grasp and ran toward the kitchen. James followed her quickly, determined not to let her escape. She reached for the phone, but James knocked it out of her hands. Who are you going to call, Emily? Your lover? He taunted, his words dripping with contempt. James, calm down, she said, her voice full of genuine terror. You're not yourself. Emily backed toward the kitchen counter where the knife rack stood. James saw the movement and intercepted her, grabbing her arm before she could reach the knives. What? Are you trying to kill me? Get rid of me for good. Let go, she cried, trying to pull away. She lost her balance and stumbled against the counter, knocking over the knife stand. The knives clattered to the floor. In a haze of adrenaline, James bent down, grabbing one of the larger knives with a wide blade. Put the knife down, Emily said, her voice trembling. Please. He stared at the shiny blade, mesmerized by it for a moment. Do you know how I felt every day in prison? James said, his voice low and strained. It felt like I was being sliced open every single day, every hour, every minute. And now, I find out you've been here with him, happy, carefree. James, please, she whispered, taking a step toward the door. But James blocked her path, stepping closer to her. I loved you, Emily, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I loved you more than my own life. Tears rolled down Emily's cheeks. I loved you too, James, but you committed a crime. You chose this path, not me. I did it for us, he shouted, to pay the rent, your damn bills. And now what? He added quietly, his words laced with bitterness. What are you going to do? Kill me. It won't bring back the past, she said softly, her voice shaking. James stood still for a long moment, his knife hand trembling. All I wanted was the truth, he said finally. I wanted to hear that you were sorry, that you missed me, that you loved me. I missed you, she whispered. For the first few months, I cried every night. But then life goes on, James. Life goes on for me, for you, for both of us. Before he could respond, they heard the sound of the front door opening. Emily, a male voice called. I forgot my file folder. Emily jerked away from James, her eyes wide with panic. She started to move toward the exit, but James grabbed her arm again. Don't move. John appeared in the kitchen doorway, tall and well-groomed, wearing an expensive suit. His eyes widened in surprise when he saw James standing there with a knife. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice laced with confusion. James didn't flinch. "I'm her husband," he said coldly. "Her real husband. James Carter, the one who escaped from prison." John's face paled slightly. "Oh, all right," he stammered. "Didn't expect this surprise, did you?" Emily seized the moment, trying to rush past John. "Run," she screamed. "He's got a knife." But John didn't budge. Instead, he moved toward Emily, stepping between her and James, as though to protect her. "Look, Mr. Carter," he said, his voice calm. "I understand how you feel, but this isn't the way to handle this. Put the knife down, and we'll talk. Calmly. Talk," James said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "What's there to talk about? You slept with my wife while I rotted in jail." Emily's face paled. "James, please," she begged, looking at John over his shoulder. "Get out before it's too late. We won't call the police if you just leave. Start a new life." "Start a new life?" James repeated bitterly. "Without you? Without everything I built?" John stepped to the side, attempting to guide Emily toward the exit. "Mr. Carter, you're making a mistake," he said, his tone firm. "Think of the consequences. You're already a fugitive. Don't make this worse." "Shut up," James shouted, his anger boiling over. "You stole my wife, my life." "No one stole anything," John said firmly. "Emily made her choice, and now we have to live with it." James lunged forward, the knife still in his hand. The situation had reached a boiling point, and nothing was going to stop him from confronting the reality he had been avoiding. With the knife aimed at John, James lunged forward, but John was faster. He pushed Emily aside, dodging the strike by grabbing James's wrist. "Run," John shouted to Emily. "Call 911. Emily dashed toward the door, but James wrenched his arm free and chased after her. He grabbed her by the hair, yanking her back. Emily cried out in pain. "Don't touch her." John acted quickly, stabbing James in the back. But James didn't even flinch. He spun around, swung the knife wildly, and the blade slashed John across the arm. John stumbled back, clutching the wound as blood started dripping. "James, stop!" Emily shouted, horrified. "You're going to kill him. He deserves it," James hissed, lunging at John once more. In that moment, Emily grabbed a heavy vase from the table and slammed it over James's head. The vase shattered on impact, shards scattering across the floor. James staggered but remained standing. Slowly, he turned to Emily, his eyes filled with raw, uncontrolled rage. "Are you protecting him?" he snarled. Emily backed up until her back hit the wall. Her voice trembled. "James, please." It all happened in an instant. James lunged again with a knife, and John tried to intercept him, but he slipped on the broken vase shards. In that split second, the blade plunged deep into Emily's stomach. Time seemed to stop. James watched in horror as Emily's eyes widened with shock, a red stain slowly spreading across her dress. She slid down the wall, leaving a trail of blood behind her. "No!" James whispered, his voice breaking. He released the knife, falling to his knees beside her. His hands pressed against the wound, but the blood poured between his fingers. "Emily, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to," he muttered, panicked, but the blood kept flowing. "Hold on, we'll call an ambulance." But it was too late. Emily's eyes started to lose their focus, and with a final effort, she raised her hand to touch his face. Her hand dropped lifelessly as the last of her life slipped away. John stood frozen in the doorway, horrified. He picked up the phone, his hand shaking, and dialed 911. "Apartment 512, Lakeside Towers," he said, voice tight with fear. James didn't hear him. He was staring at Emily's body, cradling it in his arms, gazing into her empty eyes. He didn't try to run, didn't try to hide. It was over. 7 minutes later, the police arrived. 2 squad cars and a plane closed in, and Detective Frank Donovan, an older man with graying hair and tired eyes, led the charge. They entered the apartment, guns drawn, but met no resistance. James sat on the floor, covered in blood, still holding Emily's lifeless body in his arms. "Hands up!" one of the officers shouted, commanding James to stand and move away from the body. James looked up, his face blank. "I killed her," he whispered. "I killed Emily." Detective Donovan stepped forward, His face set in an expression of exhaustion and professionalism. "James Carter?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. The photos of the Riverdale escapee had been plastered all over the news. James nodded, barely reacting. "You have the right to remain silent," the detective began, reading James's rights. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." James wasn't listening. His gaze was still fixed on Emily, her pale, lifeless form, her expression frozen in a look of surprise. At the police station, Detective Donovan personally questioned James. He sat there, handcuffed, indifferent to everything around him. "Why did you run away from Riverdale, Mr. Carter?" the detective asked, his voice calm but firm. "I wanted to see my wife," James answered in a monotone voice. "Were you planning to kill her?" the detective pressed. James shook his head. "I don't know what I was planning. I just wanted to make sure she was cheating. I wanted to make her sorry, make her repent." "But you brought a knife with you." James looked up, his eyes tired. "No, the knife was in the kitchen." "Her knife. Our knife." The detective took notes. "Tell me what happened." James recounted everything. The escape, the stakeout, the confrontation. He spoke in a steady voice, as if recounting someone else's story, someone who hadn't just turned his entire life upside down. "I didn't mean to kill her," he said, his voice breaking. It was an accident." The detective raised an eyebrow. "You stalked her, threatened her with a knife, attacked her fiancé. All of that sounds like more than an accident." "All I wanted was the truth," James repeated stubbornly. The detective leaned in. "And what is the truth, Mr. Carter?" James sat in silence for a long moment before meeting the detective's eyes. "The truth is, I've already served time for my crime. Now," he trailed off, his voice growing softer, "now I'm paying the price for what I did." Detective Donovan leaned back in his chair, scrutinizing the man sitting before him. In his 25-year career, he'd seen many killers, but rarely had he encountered someone as cold and calculating as James. "You're unrepentant," Donovan said, his voice firm, not a question but a statement. James's eyes never wavered. "I do repent," he answered quietly, "but not for coming to her. I regret meeting Emily in the first place. I regret believing in love, in loyalty, until death do us part." He raised his cuffed hands, an ironic gesture. "Now, death do us part. All's fair, isn't it?" Donovan closed his notebook, his expression unreadable as he stood. "You will be charged with escape from custody, trespassing, assault on Mr. Miller, and first-degree murder. You face life in prison, possibly the death penalty." James shrugged indifferently, his face blank. "What difference does it make? My life ended the moment the blade entered her body." Donovan turned to leave, but paused at the door. He looked back at James one last time. "You know, Mr. Carter, I've been catching criminals for years. And you know what I've noticed? The real tragedy isn't that people make mistakes. The tragedy is that they let those mistakes shape the rest of their lives. You could have started over after prison. You could have let Emily go, wished her happiness. Instead, you chose revenge. Now, there's no future for you or her." With those final words, Donovan walked out, closing the door behind him. Left alone in the empty interrogation room, James sat, his wrists bound by the cold handcuffs, and his wife's blood still staining his hands. He closed his eyes, and Emily's face reappeared in his mind. Not the lifeless, frozen expression from that night, but the vibrant, laughing face from the best days of their marriage. "I'll wait," she'd said back then. But she hadn't waited, had she? Now, it was his turn to wait. Long, endless years behind bars, haunted by the ghost of his murdered love, until the day he would die.